Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up what feels like a remarkable legal vault, this massive kind of dormant network of power. Accessible, really, only to one person, and only when a national crisis is declared. We are embarking on a deep dive into the legal framework of presidential emergency powers.
It's definitely a critical subject, and it's one that moves far beyond just the foundational powers you might think of in the Constitution.
Right.
Our source material reveals something pretty astonishing, actually. The presidency holds this kind of secret toolkit of statutory powers.
Statutory meaning granted by Congress.
Exactly.
Right.
Powers granted explicitly by Congress through laws. And these powers, they just sort of snap into existence the moment the president officially declares a national emergency.
Okay, lift it right to the scale of this, because that's the immediate shock factor here. We're not talking about, a couple of executive orders.
No, not at all.
Our sources identify well over 150 statutory powers. Imagine that. 150 different tools locked away, and the president holds the only key.
That analogy, the locked chest, I think that's exactly right for understanding this. To be precise, 137 of those standby powers become available specifically upon a presidential emergency declaration.
Okay, 137.
And then there are another 13 that require a congressional declaration. That usually involves, war or some really profound international threat.
Got it.
But the main takeaway for you, the listener, is that this is essentially Congress saying, look, we have pre-delegated vast centralized authority.
Why would they do that?
Because they recognize that in a crisis, speed often matters more than the normal procedures. They're trying to build in responsiveness.
Okay, but that sounds inherently risky, doesn't it? Giving one person access to that much concentrated authority. Before we get into the checks and balances, maybe we should nail down this philosophical tension. What exactly is the kind of crisis we're talking about here?
That's a good place to start. Legally speaking, an emergency is defined as an unforeseen combination of circumstances that requires immediate action.
Unforeseen, immediate action.
Oh, yeah. It's a moment that's perceived as threatening life or stability or well-being beyond what's considered tolerable limits. It's sudden, it's dangerous, it's unanticipated.
And crucially.
And crucially, it demands a rapid response that isn't always according to rule. It might require bending or breaking the usual processes.
That need to act outside the established rulebook. That really brings us to this historical tension, doesn't it? The one that's defined arguments about executive power in America for well over a century now.
Absolutely. It's this classic ideological split, really rooted back in the early 20th century. On one side, you had Theodore Roosevelt.
TR,
yeah. And his very expansive stewardship theory of the presidency.
the steward acting for the nation. He basically believed the president could do anything the nation needed. Right. Unless the Constitution or a law specifically said, no, you can't do that.
Exactly. It's a very broad, almost you could say unbounded view of executive action, especially in a crisis.
And the contrast to that.
Contrast that sharply with William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor. Taft held a much more limited view.
Okay.
He argued the president can exercise no power that cannot be fairly and reasonably traced back to a specific grant, either in the Constitution itself or in an act of Congress.
So no pulling powers out of thin air just because it seems like a good idea.
Right. Taft insisted there's no undefined residuum of power that the president can just grab because they feel it's in the public interest. It has to be anchored in law.
And that distinction, that really explains why this deep dive matters so much today, doesn't it? The controversy isn't just that these 150 plus powers exist. Congress created them, after all. The real controversy lies in the extent and the philosophy behind their application, which fundamentally comes down to the person in the Oval Office. Do they see themselves as, the restrained executive like Taft?
Or do they see themselves as the necessary national steward, like Roosevelt? And the crucial question then becomes, how do the laws, the actual statutes, try to constrain that inherent philosophy?
Okay, so to understand the modern constraints, we really have to look back at how things were before 1976.
Right.
Our sources describe this period pretty aptly, I think, as the Wild West era of emergency declarations.
The Wild West. Meaning what?
Meaning the presidential philosophy, whichever one it was basically unchecked by procedure. There weren't really guardrails.
So what was the fundamental problem back then?
The problem was that a single proclamation by a president could activate this entire collection of standby statutory powers all at once.
The whole toolkit just unlocked instantly.
Exactly, and often without even specifying which powers were being activated. Plus, there was no real mechanism for Congress to review them or, crucially, turn them off.
So once the switch was flipped,
The whole House stayed lit, maybe forever.
it was frankly an operational nightmare. And you could argue it was a pretty incredible failure of delegation by Congress. By 1973, congressional research found something remarkable.
What was that?
They found that the United States was operating under 4 separate, outstanding national emergency proclamations, all active at the same time.
4 continuous emergencies. What were they?
Well, the first, and probably the most famous one, was declared way back by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933.
During the banking crisis.
Right, but it wasn't just about closing banks. That declaration activated really profound powers over currency, communications, transport, a whole range of things.
Okay, that's one. What else?
The second was declared in 1950 by President Truman for the Korean War. That activated huge military mobilization powers, economic controls, things appropriate for a major conflict.
Makes sense for wartime.
Then you had 2 more declarations in 1970 and 1971. These related to, believe it or not, postal strikes and some other smaller, more domestic issues.
Wait, so let me get this straight. From 1933 all the way to 1976, we had powers designed for the Great Depression and powers for basically World War III level conflict,
Right.
running continuously alongside powers activated for things like a postal strike.
That's exactly right. This quartet of crises meant that the entire collection of statutory powers identified back then, around 470 of them.
470.
Yeah, 470 standby powers remained continuously activated. The president technically had the authority, on paper at least, to control huge parts of the economy, seize communication networks, mobilize resources.
Just because a declaration from 40 years earlier had never been switched off.
Precisely. Congress finally realized they'd maybe unwittingly created a system where declaring an emergency was easy, but ending one was virtually impossible. There was no off switch.
Okay, so this chaos, this Wild West, that leads directly to the National Emergencies Act of 1976, the NEA.
That's right. Codified in Title 50 of the U.S. Code, this was Congress's big attempt to impose order, to put in some procedural guardrails.
A necessary regulatory revolution, as you called it.
I think so, yeah. It was driven by this urgent need for Congress to regain some oversight. The NEA established several really key procedural requirements. First, the president now has to formally declare the emergency. That seems basic, but it wasn't always clear before.
Okay, formal declaration. What else?
Crucially, the president must specify which activated authorities they intend to use.
So they can't just turn on all 470 or now 150 plus powers anymore.
Not automatically. They have to explicitly identify the specific tools they're pulling out of that locked chest we talked about.
Does that mean they can only pick like 1 or 2? Or could a president still specify, say, 50 powers if they wanted?
Oh, they could certainly specify dozens. There's no hard limit on the number. But the accountability aspect is key here.
How so?
It forces transparency. The president has to go on record, tell Congress and the public, okay, I am activating powers X, Y, and Z for this specific reason.
And that allows critics, Congress, the public, to immediately question the necessity of those specific choices.
Right. Exactly. It adds a layer of political friction, a need for justification that just wasn't there in the Wild West era.
Okay, specifying powers is a big one. What other guardrails did the NEA create?
Well, first, there are general procedural requirements. Things like reporting to Congress, maintaining records, basically being accountable for the actions taken under the emergency.
Right.
Second, and this is arguably the most important administrative check, was the automatic sunset provision.
The expiration date. The built-in clock.
Precisely. Under the NEA, declarations must terminate automatically after 1 year. Full stop.
Unless
the president formally renews it, they have to publish a notice in the Federal Register and transmit that notice to Congress, justifying the continuation.
So it forces an annual review every single year.
Every year. The president effectively has to go back to Congress and say, this crisis is still ongoing. It's still severe enough to warrant keeping these extraordinary powers active. It prevents emergencies from just lingering indefinitely like they used to.
And what about Congress's own power? Could they step in and terminate an emergency early if they disagreed with the president, say 6 months in?
Yes, the NEA did establish a mechanism for Congress to terminate an emergency declaration earlier. Originally, it was designed to be done via something called a concurrent resolution.
Okay, we'll definitely need to unpack what happened with that mechanism later.
Absolutely. It's a crucial part of the story. But the initial intent was clear. Congress wanted a structured way to pull the plug, to say, stop. The NEA fundamentally tried to take us out of that Wild West and into a more regulated system.
A regulated system, but one still clearly fraught with tension over just how far executive power should go, even with these rules.
That tension is inherent, I think.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the framework, the NEA, the rules. Let's get into the substance. What's in that toolkit? When the president makes that formal declaration, what kind of instantaneous control is actually unlocked?
Right. This is where we move from legal procedure to tangible impact. These 150-plus powers are incredibly diverse, but we can group them into maybe 3 major categories. Think of them as granting the executive instant centralized control over the 3 pillars of any modern crisis response.
Okay, 3 pillars. What are they?
You could think of it as policy, the power to waive rules and regulations, then people, the power over military and personnel, and finally, the purse control over economic activity and assets.
Policy, people, and purse. Got it.
Right.
Let's start with policy control. The ability to sort of override normal bureaucratic rules when immediate action is needed. #gay public health and welfare powers.
Right. These authorities really show how emergency declarations can immediately cut through federal red tape, especially when it comes to delivering vital services like healthcare.
These aren't always directly wielded by the president, right?
Often, no. These powers are frequently delegated to agency secretaries, like the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS. And importantly, they can often be triggered by multiple conditions, not just an NEA declaration, but also maybe a disaster declaration under the Stafford Act or a specific public health emergency declaration.
Okay, so what's a major example here? Something that impacts healthcare delivery directly.
A really significant one is the waiver authority under Section 1135 of the Social Security Act.
Section 1135. What does that let HHS do?
This gives the HHS secretary massive power during an emergency. When it's activated, they can waive dozens of rules, things related to patient confidentiality, like HIPAA in certain contexts, provider certification requirements, sanctions for non-compliance, and other provisions that might normally slow things down.
So think about Medicare and Medicaid rules, which can be incredibly complex.
Exactly. Those rules are necessary for normal operations, but in a crisis, say, a hurricane devastates an area or a pandemic hits, they can become huge obstacles to rapid response.
So this waiver power lets the HHS secretary say, okay, for now, doctors licensed in one state can practice in this disaster zone. Or we can set up field hospitals immediately without meeting every single building code requirement. Things like that.
Precisely. It allows for that kind of flexibility, waiving site of care limitations, easing credentialing, streamlining billing. It's all about speeding up patient care and getting resources where they're needed fast.
Have we seen this used recently?
Oh, yes. It was used back during the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. And critically, it was invoked by President Trump's Proclamation 9994 in March 2020, right at the start of the COVID-19 outbreak.
Ah, okay.
That gave healthcare providers really unprecedented flexibility to manage hospital capacity, staffing shortages, telehealth expansion, all the things needed during that national emergency.
Okay, that's a big one. What about getting new medicines or treatments out quickly, things that aren't fully approved yet?
That's another crucial policy power. It's the authority to issue an emergency use authorization, or EUA.
EUA. We heard that term a lot during COVID.
We certainly did. It's found in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, 21 U.S.C. Section 360BB3. This grants the Secretary of HHS the power to authorize the use of an unapproved medical product, like a drug, a vaccine, a diagnostic test, or even authorize an unapproved use of an already approved product.
So this is how things can move from the lab to the public in like months instead of the usual years it takes for full FDA approval.
Exactly. It's a pathway designed for speed in a crisis, but it's not automatic.
What triggers it? What's the justification needed?
The EUA has to be justified by a specific determination. There needs to be a declared domestic, military, or public health emergency involving heightened risks from certain agents, biological, chemical, radiological, or nuclear threats.
So it's designed for acute, serious threats where waiting for the full FDA trial process would likely cause unacceptable harm or loss of life.
That's the rationale. And our sources note this power isn't new. It's been invoked over a dozen times since 2004 alone. Responding to things like potential anthrax exposures, Ebola outbreaks, the Zika virus, it's a key tool for public health emergencies.
It really highlights that trade-off in an emergency. overriding normal regulatory caution in favor of speed and immediate need.
Absolutely. And you see that trade-off in other areas too, like environmental policy.
Ah, so
Well, there's a provision, 42 USC section 7410, that deals with suspending parts of the Clean Air Act.
suspending the Clean Air Act. That sounds controversial.
It allows a state governor to petition the president to temporarily suspend parts of the state's implementation plan for the act. This means essentially a temporary loosening of air quality or emissions standards
For how long?
for up to 4 months.
Why would a governor ever ask for that? What's the scenario?
The condition is very strict.
Yeah.
There has to be a national or regional energy emergency of severe magnitude.
Ah, energy emergency. Okay.
So imagine a disaster, maybe a cyber attack or a massive storm, cuts off natural gas supplies or knocks out major power plants. And maybe the only way to restore essential power quickly is to fire up older coal-fired plants that don't meet current standards.
So this power lets them make that temporary environmental compromise to keep the lights and heat on.
Exactly. It prioritizes immediate human needs, power, heat, critical infrastructure over the longer-term environmental policy goals, but only for a limited time and under specific conditions.
Has this been used?
It was notably used, according to our sources, back in the late 1970s. There were regional energy emergencies declared in several Midwestern states, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, others during periods of severe fuel scarcity and cold weather. It allowed them some flexibility then. Hashtag B, military and personnel powers. The individual's emergency powers.
Okay, let's transition now from policy to the second pillar you mentioned, control over people, specifically military personnel. This feels like where the emergency declaration stops being theoretical and starts directly impacting the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of individuals.
That's a very accurate way to put it. These are sometimes referred to as the individual's emergency powers. And the ability to mobilize the Ready Reserve is probably the most famous and arguably the most impactful of these powers. It's found in Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Section 12302A.
Okay, Section 12302A. For our listeners who might not have a military background, can you explain exactly what this Ready Reserve call-up power allows the government to do, laid out clearly?
It's an immense power. It allows an authority designated by the Secretary of Defense, so usually high-level military leadership, to order units or even individual members of the Ready Reserve onto active duty.
The Ready Reserve being?
These are trained military personnel, reservists, who are part of the civilian workforce but are obligated to serve if called upon.
Okay. And how long can they be called up for under this power?
For up to 24 consecutive months, 2 full years.
2 years. And here's the crucial part I think you mentioned earlier.
Yes. The critical defining feature of this specific emergency power is that the call-up can be done without their consent.
Without their consent. Let's just pause on that. This isn't asking for volunteers. This isn't a voluntary deployment.
No.
This is the government reaching directly into someone's civilian life, their job, their family, their plans, and overriding their personal consent to put them on active military duty for up to 2 years.
That is precisely the scope of this emergency power. It's the ability to instantly mobilize trained manpower, pulling it from the civilian sector back into the military structure. The rationale is ensuring national defense, providing operational capability during sustained crises when volunteer forces might not be sufficient.
Is there any limit on how many people can be called up this way?
There is a statutory limit under this specific authority. No more than 1,000 members of the Ready Reserve may be on active duty without their consent at any one time using this power.
1 million people. That's still a huge number. When has this power been used most significantly?
It was used extensively back in 1991 in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And then, very profoundly, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, that triggered massive long-term mobilizations as the entire military structure had to rapidly adapt for global counterterrorism operations.
And more recently?
More recently, it was used during the spread of the novel coronavirus in 2020. Reserve units, particularly medical and logistical personnel, were mobilized under this authority to support the pandemic response, even for missions within the continental United States.
So it's not just for overseas wars?
No, it can be used for domestic emergencies too, if deemed necessary for national security or response efforts.
Okay, beyond just calling people up involuntarily, the president also gains power during an emergency to basically ignore or suspend many of the established rules that govern military careers and the structure of the armed forces.
That's right. The whole personnel rulebook gains a degree of flexibility. For instance, there's 10 U.S.C. Section 527. This gives the president the authority to suspend the statutory limits on the number and distribution of officers in the military.
Limits like how many colonels or generals you can have.
Exactly. As well as the authorized strengths, the total numbers of reserve officers in various grades.
Why would suspending those limits be necessary in a crisis? Aren't those limits usually there for a reason, like controlling costs or preventing a top-heavy structure?
In normal times, absolutely. But imagine a sudden, large-scale crisis unfolds. Maybe you need to stand up multiple new commands, deploy forces to entirely new regions. If the existing statutory cap says you can only have, say, X number of colonels, but your operational demands suddenly require 3 times that many to lead new units or staff new headquarters.
Those limits become a bureaucratic bottleneck.
Precisely. They become crippling. This power allows the president to rapidly promote, assign, and reorganize the officer corps to meet the immediate needs of the crisis, without waiting for Congress to change the law.
Was this used after 9/11?
Yes, it was invoked almost immediately after 9/11 through Proclamation 7463 and Executive Order 13223 to allow for the necessary expansion and restructuring of the military for the new challenges.
Okay. What about the other end of the career, like retirement? If the nation needs a highly skilled cyber expert or maybe a critical medical specialist who's about to hit their mandatory retirement age right in the middle of the emergency.
That scenario is covered by 10 U.S.C. Section 12305A. This allows the president to suspend any law relating to the promotion, retirement, or separation of any member of the armed forces.
Any member.
Any member who is deemed essential to the national security during a period when reserves are on active duty under an emergency authority like the one we just discussed.
So you can basically stop lost critical personnel.
Exactly. It ensures that essential skills and expertise remain available to the military, rather than potentially disappearing due to mandatory retirement rules right when they're needed most.
Okay, that covers personnel rules. Now we have to talk about the power that became the center of a massive political and legal fight recently. The Military Construction Fund Diversion Power. That's 10 U.S.C. Section 2808.
Right, Section 2808. This power allows the Secretary of Defense to undertake military construction projects, building things like bases, facilities, infrastructure that are deemed necessary to support the emergency use of the armed forces.
Okay, necessary for the emergency. And the controversial part is where the money comes from.
That's the key. The Secretary can use funds that Congress had already appropriated, but for other unrelated military construction projects, money that hasn't been spent yet, unobligated funds.
So let's say there's a crisis requiring a rapid deployment overseas. Maybe they urgently need new barracks or an airstrip built at a staging base. Under this power, the Pentagon could potentially take money that Congress had specifically earmarked to build, I don't know, a new base gym in Kansas.
Right.
And divert that money without asking Congress again to build the emergency airstrip in the Middle East instead.
That's essentially the original intent behind it, yes. To provide rapid financial flexibility for urgent operational construction needs that arise suddenly during an emergency deployment.
Are there limits on how much money can be moved this way?
Historically, there have been caps. Our sources mention limits, though they can be amended by Congress. Something like up to $500 million for overseas projects and $100 million for domestic projects per emergency, potentially.
But the big controversy wasn't about building an emergency airstrip overseas, was it?
No, it wasn't. The controversy exploded when President Trump invoked this specific section, 2808, back in 2019. That was Proclamation 9A44.
And the purpose?
To redirect billions of dollars in military construction funds, money Congress had appropriated for things like base housing, schools, training facilities for military families, towards building the wall on the southern border.
A project for which Congress had explicitly considered and then denied the president's full funding request through the normal appropriations process.
Exactly. The president argued that the situation at the border constituted a national emergency that required the use of the armed forces and support roles, and that the wall construction was necessary military construction to support that use.
So this transformed what sounds like a logistical emergency power, meant for battlefield needs, into a vehicle for funding a major contentious domestic policy initiative that Congress had refused to fund.
That was certainly the view of the critics and many in Congress. It raised profound questions about the separation of powers and the intended scope of these emergency authorities. Hashtag see economic and asset control powers.
Okay, let's move to the third pillar you outlined. Control over the purse. The president gains immense economic and financial authority during an emergency, often focused on foreign actors or international threats, right?
That's right. And the absolute cornerstone of this category is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, usually known as IEPA.
IEEPA. I feel like I hear that acronym a lot in news about sanctions.
You definitely do. It's codified in Title 50 as well, sections 1701 to 1707. If you think of the NEA as the procedural lockbox for declaring the emergency, IEEPA is one of the most powerful and frequently used tools inside that box.
Just how broad is IEPA's reach? What can the president actually do under this act?
It grants the president incredibly sweeping authority to investigate, regulate, or prohibit almost any kind of financial or commercial transaction involving designated entities.
Designated entities meaning?
That could be individuals, groups, companies, even entire countries. The powers include blocking or freezing their assets that are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, imposing sanctions on them, restricting trade. It's very broad.
And what's the trigger for using IEEPA?
Crucially, IEPA is designed specifically to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, where that threat originates in whole or substantial part outside the United States.
So it has to be an external threat. This isn't typically for domestic economic issues.
Generally, no. It's the legal foundation for most of our foreign sanctions programs against rogue states, terrorist organizations, weapons proliferators, and so on.
It really is the bedrock, then.
It absolutely is. And a key point of clarity here, IEPA declarations don't happen in a vacuum. They must be based on a new, specific threat, and they are almost exclusively invoked in tandem with the National Emergencies Act.
So you need an NEA declaration of emergency first, citing this external threat, and then you can unlock the IEPA powers.
That's the standard procedure. The NEA provides the overarching emergency framework, and IEPA provides the specific economic tools for that emergency.
How often is IEPA actually used? Is it rare?
Far from it. The invocation rate really shows its importance. Our sources indicate it's been used as the basis for, I think, 55 separate national emergency declarations since it was enacted in 1977.
55 times. And these aren't just quick one-off things.
No, typically these IEPA-based emergencies are renewed annually by the president, as required by the NEA's Sunset Clause. And on average, they stay active for about 9 years.
9 years on average. So these become sustained instruments of foreign policy, not just short-term crisis responses.
Exactly. They provide the long-term legal authority for ongoing sanctions regimes against countries like Iran or North Korea, or against transnational threats like terrorism or narcotics trafficking.
Can we look at an example that maybe involves something less traditional than a hostile nation state? Like, can IEPA be used against newer threats, say cyber attacks or election interference?
Absolutely. While traditional targets are still common, IEPA has proven adaptable. A really good modern example is Executive Order 13848, which was issued in 2018.
What did that one do?
It declared a national emergency specifically for the purpose of imposing certain sanctions in the event of foreign interference in a United States election.
Okay.
This order leverages IEPA authority to allow the government to identify and then block the property and transactions of foreign individuals or entities, whether they're state-sponsored or not, who are deemed responsible for attempting to interfere in or undermine U.S. elections through cyber-enabled means or other methods.
So it shows how this decades-old law can be applied to really 21st century non-military threats.
Precisely. Its breadth gives it that flexibility.
Okay, so IEPA covers financial and transactional control. What about control over actual physical assets located in or near the U.S., like maybe ships or port facilities?
There are powers for that too. One key example is the Vessel Control Authority, found under Title 46 of the U.S. Code, Section 70051.
Vessel control. What does that entail?
During a declared national emergency, this gives the Secretary of Transportation, acting usually through the Coast Guard, the power to make rules governing the anchorage, movement, and operation of any vessel, whether it's foreign or domestic, within U.S. territorial waters.
Any vessel. That sounds like immediate, practical control over all maritime traffic near our shores.
It is. Think about the security implications. If there's a threat of, say, a terrorist attack using a ship, or maybe a risk of environmental contamination from a damaged tanker, or even during periods of significant domestic unrest where controlling port access is crucial.
This power allows the government to instantly take charge, dictating where ships can go, where they anchor, maybe even searching them, or preventing them from entering ports altogether.
Exactly. It's a fundamental security and safety power for controlling the maritime domain during a crisis. Our sources mention it's been routinely invoked concerning vessel movements related to Cuba since 1996.
To regulate traffic or enforce embargoes, perhaps?
Likely related to enforcing restrictions, yes. And it was also invoked back in 2017 via Executive Order 13810, specifically to prohibit ships that had called at North Korean ports from then calling at U.S. ports within a certain time frame.
So directly impacting international shipping routes and commerce as part of a broader economic pressure campaign against North Korea.
That's right. It shows the direct link between controlling physical access and achieving broader economic or foreign policy goals.
Okay. And finally, in this economic category, there's a power that sounds like it's straight out of an old war movie. The alien property custodian.
It does sound archaic, doesn't it? This is 50 U.S.C., Section 4309, and it is indeed a historical relic with roots going back to World War I and II.
Alien property custodian. What does it allow?
During a declared national emergency, typically one involving armed conflict, this power historically allowed the U.S. government to seize, manage, and even sell property located in the U.S. that belonged to citizens or governments of enemy nations.
So seizing enemy assets within our borders.
Essentially, yes. The specific provision cited allows for the sale of such alien property or interests that are already in government custody before a final judgment is reached in any legal proceedings concerning that property.
Why would that be needed? To act quickly.
Exactly. It speaks to the historical ability of the government during wartime to quickly liquidate or nationalize the assets of declared enemies or hostile entities, removing those resources from potential enemy control before lengthy court battles could conclude. While maybe less frequently relevant today than IEPA, it's still technically on the books as part of this emergency toolkit.
It really underscores the breadth here. Whether the crisis is a pandemic needing policy waivers, a military threat needing personnel mobilization, or international tensions requiring economic sanctions, the executive gains this incredibly far-reaching, almost instantaneous control across policy, people, and the purse once that national emergency button is pressed.
That's the reality of the framework. So, given the sheer scope of these powers we've just laid out, controlling personnel, finances, regulations, the inevitable question comes up: what actually restrains the president from overusing or abusing these authorities? What are the checks?
Right, and we have to reiterate that fundamental constitutional point first. Outside of that very specific, highly debated, and judicially reviewable power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus during rebellion or invasion, the Constitution itself does not allow for the suspension of any of its other provisions, like the Bill of Rights, even during an emergency. So judicial review by the courts, and of course public opinion and political pressure, those remain as underlying checks.
Absolutely. Those are the foundational backstops. But Congress's primary statutory instrument for attempting to restrain the use of these emergency powers is the National Emergencies Act itself, the NEA.
With those procedural checks we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The requirements for transparency in the declaration, the specification of powers being used, the annual sunset provision forcing renewal, and that mechanism Congress created for early termination, those were designed to be the checks.
But how well do they work in practice? Those checks were put to a really severe test just a few years ago, weren't they?
They certainly were. The Southern Border funding dispute in 2019 provides, I think, a perfect case study. It really illustrates the political realities and difficulties of Congress trying to stop an activated emergency once the president has committed to using it.
Okay, let's walk through that. What was the setup?
The conflict was very explicit. Congress, through the normal appropriations process, had specifically provided about $1.375 billion for border barriers. President Trump had requested much more, around $5.6 billion. Congress said no to the larger amount.
Okay, so Congress made its spending decision clear.
Yes. The president then declared a national emergency via Proclamation 9844 on February 15, 2019. He cited a crisis at the border requiring military support.
And the purpose of this declaration was to unlock which specific emergency power?
Primarily that military construction fund diversion power we talked about, 10 U.S.C. Section 2808. The plan was to use that authority to redirect funds already appropriated for other military projects towards building the border wall.
So using the emergency power as a way to essentially bypass Congress's refusal to provide the funding through the normal legislative process.
That was certainly how many in Congress, including members of the president's own party, viewed it. They saw it as a significant overreach and encroachment on Congress's power of the purse.
So Congress decided to push back using the NEA's own procedures.
They did. They moved to activate the NEA's termination mechanism. The House initiated H.J. Shiz 46, which was a joint resolution specifically designed to terminate the border emergency declaration.
And the NEA has special rules to make sure such a resolution gets voted on quickly, right? It can't just be bottled up in committee.
Exactly. The NEA includes expedited procedures. Crucially, in the Senate, these procedures meant the resolution only needed simple majority support to pass. It couldn't be filibustered, which normally requires 60 votes to overcome.
Okay, so the NEA's procedural design worked in that sense. It allowed Congress to quickly bring its disagreement to a formal vote.
It did work in that respect, yes. The resolution passed the House, and then it passed the Senate with a vote of 59-41.
59-41. That's a bipartisan majority in the Senate voting to terminate the emergency.
It was. It clearly demonstrated that a majority in both houses of Congress disagreed with the president's emergency declaration and wanted it ended.
What happened next? Why didn't that stop it?
Well, this goes back to a crucial change in the NEA that happened years ago, stemming from a Supreme Court ruling we'll get to in a moment. Because of that change, the joint resolution, even after passing both houses, still required the president's signature to become law.
Which, predictably,
Which the president provided, but in the form of a veto. President Trump vetoed H.J.R. 46.
Okay, so Congress passed the resolution, the president vetoed it. What's the next step in that process?
For Congress to override that veto, they needed a two-thirds majority vote in both the House and the Senate.
A much higher bar than the simple majority needed to pass it initially.
A significantly higher bar. The House held a vote to override the veto, but it failed to achieve the necessary two-thirds threshold. The vote was 248-181.
Not enough.
Not nearly enough. So the emergency declaration remained in effect. The redirection of billions in military construction funds proceeded, despite the majority opposition in Congress. The executive checkmate essentially prevailed over the legislative consensus.
So the NEA provided a pathway for Congress to register its disapproval quickly and formally. But the political reality seems to be that this check is almost toothless if the president can maintain enough support within their own party to prevent a two-thirds veto override.
That is the core structural asymmetry that this case highlighted so vividly. The president can activate these immense powers instantly with just a signature, perhaps leaning on that Rooseveltian stewardship idea.
Right.
But for Congress to turn those powers off against the president's will, they need to overcome this incredibly high hurdle of a veto override.
So when did the border emergency finally end?
It only ended later after a change in administration. President Biden issued Proclamation 1142 on his first day in office, January 20, 2021. That proclamation officially terminated the border emergency declaration and directed officials to pause the wall construction, halt the obligation of those diverted funds, and develop a plan to redirect any remaining funds back to their originally intended military construction purposes.
A clear example of how elections become the ultimate check in that situation. Now, beyond these big formal clashes using the NEA process, have there been instances where the executive branch maybe tried to use emergency-like powers without fully engaging the NEA's framework?
Yeah.
Sort of testing the boundaries?
Yes, the response to Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 provides a really interesting example of that kind of, let's call it, procedural anomaly. It involved a law called the Davis-Bacon Act.
Davis-Bacon, what does that do?
The Davis-Bacon Act requires that contractors working on federally funded construction projects must pay their workers the prevailing wage for that type of work in the local area. It often means paying union-scale wages.
Okay. And how did that relate to Katrina?
Well, in September 2005, in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina's devastation along the Gulf Coast, President George W. Bush issued a proclamation. It suspended the application of those Davis-Bacon wage requirements in the disaster zones.
What was the stated goal of doing that?
The argument was that suspending the higher prevailing wage requirements would lower reconstruction costs and speed up the rebuilding process by allowing contractors to pay lower wages.
Okay, but here's the procedurally interesting part, right? He didn't declare a national emergency under the NEA to do this.
That's correct. The administration argued that the conditions themselves constituted a national emergency under the specific statute that contained the Davis-Bacon suspension authority, which is in Title 40 of the U.S. Code. They essentially tried to activate that specific power by declaring an emergency only within the context of that one law without going through the formal NEA declaration process.
Why would they do that? What would bypassing the NEA achieve?
Well, by not issuing a formal NEA declaration, they arguably avoided triggering the NEA's procedural requirements like the specification of powers, the reporting, and most importantly, that one-year automatic sunset clock. It looked like an attempt to get the emergency power without the NEA's procedural handcuffs attached.
How was that move received? Did it work?
It generated significant and immediate backlash, especially from labor organizations and Democrats in Congress who saw it as an attack on worker protections disguised as disaster relief. While the strict legal propriety of bypassing the NEA could have been debated or challenged in court,
The political pressure mounted quickly.
it did. And in the end, the president himself revoked the proclamation suspending Davis-Bacon just a couple of months later, in November 2005. The political heat was likely the most effective check in that instance.
Interesting. Did the revocation acknowledge the NEA issue?
Interestingly, yes, the subsequent proclamation that revoked the suspension did explicitly cite the National Emergencies Act. This suggested, perhaps tacitly, that the administration recognized after the fact the legal prudence or necessity of operating within that broader NEA framework, even if they had initially tried to sidestep it.
Okay, so that highlights the political checks. But to really understand why the president's veto was so decisive in the southern border case, we need to go back to that change in Congress's termination power you mentioned. This involves the legislative veto problem.
Yes, this is absolutely critical for understanding the modern balance of power, or perhaps imbalance, regarding emergency declarations. It hinges on a foundational Supreme Court case.
So when the NEA was first passed in 1976, how did Congress initially design its own power to terminate an emergency?
They designed it to be powerful. The original NEA allowed Congress to terminate a presidentially declared national emergency via a concurrent resolution.
Okay, explain the difference for us. What's a concurrent resolution versus the joint resolution used in the border wall fight? And why did Congress prefer the concurrent one initially?
Right. A joint resolution, like H.J. Res. 46 in the border case, passes both the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the president for signature or veto. It has the force of law if signed or if a veto is overridden. A concurrent resolution also passes both the House and Senate, but crucially, it does not go to the president for signature. It's traditionally used for internal congressional matters or expressing the sense of Congress.
But in the original NEA, Congress tried to give this concurrent resolution the power to actually terminate a legal status, the national emergency, without the president's approval.
Exactly. This was Congress trying to give itself a potent check. They could, theoretically, unilaterally turn off the emergency powers with a simple majority vote in both houses, and the president couldn't stop them with a veto. This type of mechanism, where Congress uses something other than a law presented to the president to overturn executive action, is known as the legislative veto.
A legislative veto. And the Supreme Court had something to say about that.
They certainly did. In a landmark 1983 case called INS v. Chadha, it wasn't about the NEA directly, it was about immigration law, but the ruling had sweeping implications.
What did the court rule in Chadha?
The court ruled that this legislative veto mechanism, the concurrent resolution being used to change legal rights and duties, violated the presentment clause of the Constitution. That's Article 1, Section 7.
The presentment clause requires...
It requires that every bill, every piece of legislation that is intended to have the force and effect of law, must be presented to the president for signature or veto before it can become law. The court said that if Congress could pass a concurrent resolution to terminate a national emergency, effectively changing the legal status quo and altering the president's authorities without giving the president a chance to weigh in via signature or veto, it violated that core principle of separation of powers.
So the Chadha ruling basically struck down Congress's preferred and much stronger veto-proof termination mechanism in the NEA.
It invalidated it, yes,
Yeah.
along with hundreds of other legislative veto provisions that Congress had written into various laws over the years.
So how did Congress adapt the NEA after Chadha effectively took away their unilateral power to end emergencies?
They had to amend the law. In 1985, Congress amended the National Emergencies Act to require a joint resolution for termination instead of a concurrent one.
The same kind of resolution used in the border wall fight.
Exactly. A joint resolution, which again requires passage by both houses and the president's signature, or that very difficult two-thirds override of a presidential veto.
So that single Supreme Court decision, INS v. Chadha, dramatically shifted the balance of power in these emergency disputes, didn't it? It tilted it significantly towards the executive.
It really did. It transformed Congress's intended potent veto-proof check into a check that is, as the border wall case showed, nearly impossible to deploy successfully against a politically determined president who can maintain party discipline against an override. Okay, it's really essential now that we pivot slightly. We focused heavily on the National Emergencies Act, which primarily governs, domestic crisis declarations, economic sanctions, things like that. But there's a parallel, though distinct, legal framework that specifically controls the introduction of U.S. military forces into hostilities.
Right, you're talking about the War Powers Resolution, or WPR.
Exactly. Public Law 93-148, enacted back in 1973.
And the timing there isn't accidental, right? 1973, right in the thick of the political fallout and revelations about the expansion of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely. The context is vital. The WPR was Congress's direct and very controversial attempt to reassert its constitutional authority over decisions about war and peace. Its entire stated purpose is to ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President applies when the U.S. commits its armed forces to actual or imminent hostilities.
Trying to prevent another situation where military engagement escalates significantly without explicit congressional buy-in.
That was the driving force. The resolution explicitly tries to limit the president's inherent constitutional power as commander-in-chief when it comes to putting troops in harm's way.
So under the War Powers Resolution, what are the very specific, narrowly defined conditions under which the president is allowed to introduce U.S. forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent without getting a formal declaration of war from Congress first?
The WPR lays out only 3 specific circumstances. The president may only exercise this power pursuant to: number 1, a formal declaration of war by Congress, the traditional constitutional route.
Okay.
Number 2, specific statutory authorization from Congress. This could be something like an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF like those passed after 9/11, or for Iraq.
Right, a specific law allowing force for a specific purpose.
Exactly. And number 3, a national emergency created by an actual attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces.
So self-defense in response to an attack.
Correct. According to the text of the WPR, any other introduction of U.S. forces into actual or imminent hostilities is considered unauthorized by the resolution.
Now, how has the executive branch historically viewed the War Powers Resolution? Have presidents generally accepted these limitations?
Oh, far from it. It's been a source of interbranch conflict since the day it was passed over President Nixon's veto. Virtually every president since 1973, regardless of party, has viewed the WPR's core constraints as an unconstitutional infringement on their exclusive powers as commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution.
So they comply with parts of it, but maybe not embrace its legitimacy.
That's often the approach. Presidents frequently submit the reports to Congress that the WPR requires when deploying troops. However, they often carefully phrase their submissions, stating they are reporting consistent with the WPR's requirements, rather than saying they are acting pursuant to the WPR.
A subtle legal distinction.
It is, but it's designed to avoid legally conceding that the WPR itself is constitutional or binding on their authority. This inherent tension over the resolution's legitimacy continues to this day.
Okay, let's look at the procedures the WPR mandates, assuming for a moment it's being followed. It starts with consultation, right?
Yes. Section 3 requires consultation. It states the president shall consult with Congress in every possible instance before introducing armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances.
Every possible instance. The goal being to bring Congress into the decision-making loop early, not just inform them after the fact.
That's the clear intent, yes, to ensure collective judgment before troops are committed.
And then, once forces are introduced into hostilities or a situation of imminent hostilities, a clock starts ticking.
A very specific clock. The president must submit a written report to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate within 48 hours.
Within 48 hours of the troops being introduced into that hostile situation, and what has to be in that report?
It has to be pretty detailed. It needs to specify the circumstances necessitating the introduction of forces, the constitutional and legislative authority under which the introduction took place, citing one of those 3 permissible conditions, presumably, and the estimated scope and duration of the hostilities or involvement.
And submitting that formal 48-hour report, That triggers the most significant check in the War Powers Resolution, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It starts the clock on the termination mechanism, the WPR's attempt to put a hard limit on the duration of unauthorized military action.
Okay, so what is that limit? How long can forces remain engaged without explicit congressional approval once that report is filed?
Under Section 5B of the resolution, the president must terminate the use of U.S. armed forces within 60 calendar days after that report is submitted or is required to have been submitted.
60 days. 2 months.
2 months. Unless Congress, during that 60-day period, takes one of three actions. 1, Congress formally declares war. 2, Congress enacts a specific authorization for such use of forces, like an AUMF. Or 3, Congress extends the 60-day period by law. There's also an exception if Congress is physically unable to meet because of an armed attack upon the United States.
So basically, Congress has a 2-month window after notification to either formally approve the military action or, according to the WPR, the president is legally obligated to pull the troops out.
That is the rule written into the resolution, yes. Now, there is one potential extension built in.
Okay.
That 60-day period can be extended for up to an additional 30 days, making it 90 days total, if the president certifies in writing to Congress that unavoidable military necessity, respecting the safety of the U.S. armed forces, requires their continued presence for the sole purpose of ensuring their prompt and safe withdrawal.
So, a 30-day grace period, specifically for pulling out safely if needed. But 90 days is the absolute maximum time frame under the WPR for unauthorized hostilities without explicit congressional approval.
According to the text of the WPR, yes, 60 days, potentially extendable to 90 for withdrawal purposes, is the limit before congressional authorization is required.
Now, it's interesting to compare the termination mechanism here to the one in the NEA, especially after the Chadha ruling.
Yeah.
Does the War Powers Resolution still contain that language about Congress being able to force a withdrawal using a concurrent resolution, the one that doesn't need a presidential signature?
It actually does. Section 5C of the WPR still states that at any time U.S. forces are engaged in hostilities outside the U.S. without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization, Congress can direct the president to remove those forces by adopting a concurrent resolution.
So Congress tried to keep that legislative veto power specifically for ending military engagements, even after Chadha.
They wrote it that way, yes. It reflects Congress's strong desire to have a mechanism to unilaterally compel withdrawal. However, because the Supreme Court's 1983 INS v. Chadha decision broadly invalidated legislative vetoes like concurrent resolutions that purport to change the legal status quo.
That Section 5C concurrent resolution mechanism is considered legally questionable or likely unconstitutional, even though it's still technically written in the statute.
That's the general consensus among legal scholars and, importantly, within the executive branch. While it remains on the books, its legal enforceability against a president who refused to comply is highly dubious after Chadha. It really reflects the deep, ongoing constitutional struggle between Congress and the president over war powers, and the difficulty Congress has had in creating binding checks on the executive in this specific area. #tag inclusion and final thought.
Well, this has been a really exhaustive exploration, hasn't it? Delving into this hidden world of the president's extraordinary powers. We've clearly seen these authorities are not just, theoretical concepts sitting in law books.
Not at all. They are frequently invoked tools. We see it with IEPA sanctions, shaping our foreign policy almost daily. We saw it with the HHS waiver authority under Section 1135, fundamentally shaping our national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. These powers have real-world impact.
And we established that the National Emergencies Act back in '76 was this really vital procedural reform. It did end that chaotic Wild West era by forcing more transparency, requiring the president to actually specify which powers are being used, and crucially, imposing that automatic one-year sunset provision.
Those procedural checks are important, no doubt. They create hurdles and require justifications that didn't exist before.
But I think the key takeaway, the crux of the matter that emerged, particularly from the border wall case study and the Chadha ruling, is this fundamental structural asymmetry.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The president can declare an emergency and activate these vast powers, sometimes unilaterally redirecting billions of dollars, essentially with just the stroke of a pen, maybe leaning on that broad Rooseveltian stewardship philosophy you mentioned.
Easy activation.
Yet because the Supreme Court effectively neutered Congress's legislative veto power back in 1983, Congress now faces this immense political mountain, needing a 2/3 veto override in both houses to actually terminate those powers against the president's will.
The termination mechanism is structurally weak in the face of presidential opposition. That's clear.
And we also highlighted the profound human impact, especially with those individuals' emergency powers, thinking specifically about the Ready Reserve Call-Up Power, 10 U.S.C. Section 12302.
Right. The power allowing the executive branch to command the services, the time, the lives, essentially, of private citizens, pulling them from their families and jobs for up to 2 full years without their consent. That really demonstrates the ultimate reach of government power in a declared crisis.
Absolutely. And finally, we touched on the War Powers Resolution Congress's attempt to put guardrails around the decision to initiate hostilities, forcing transparency through reporting, imposing that 60 to 90-day clock on unauthorized military action. Though, as you noted, the WPR itself remains this constant point of contention and constitutional challenge from the executive branch.
It does. And all of this brings us, I think, to a final, maybe provocative thought, which actually stems directly from a concluding observation in our source material. It noted that the National Emergencies Act itself, this foundational statute governing most of these powers, has not been systematically revisited or significantly updated by congressional overseers since it was first enacted way back in 1976.
Not since 1976, despite everything that's changed since then.
Apparently not in a comprehensive way. And if you think about the sheer increase in the complexity and the frequency of national emergencies we've faced since 1976, from sophisticated cyber threats that didn't exist then, to global pandemics, to new forms of international economic warfare, the core structural problem remains. The presidential veto makes congressional termination incredibly difficult once an emergency is declared.
So the question then, for you, the listener, to really consider is this. If the current system is designed, perhaps unintentionally due to court rulings, so that the president's declaration of emergency is relatively easy to initiate but nearly impossible for Congress to reverse against presidential opposition, what potential reforms could Congress realistically implement? Reforms that might truly restore some balance. Should the focus maybe shift? Instead of making termination harder, perhaps the bar for continuation of an emergency beyond that first year should be significantly higher, maybe requiring affirmative congressional approval to continue, rather than just passive acceptance.
That's certainly a direction for debate. How do you recalibrate the on switch versus the off switch?
Exactly. That's the debate, I think, that will likely define the evolution of executive power and congressional oversight in the face of crisis for the next generation. Something to definitely keep an eye on.